Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Jennie Reznek's play, I Turned Away and She Was Gone. So this is a one-person show that adapts the Demeter and Persephone myth from ancient Greece. I've said this before on this channel. I'm not a huge fan of one-person shows and monologue plays and things like this, because there are multiple characters here, even though they're all played by the same actor. This doesn't necessarily feel as much like a monologue play as some others, but it's not my favorite mode of theater, so I'll say that right up front. That being said, the play does some very interesting things. The thing that I find most striking is actually the way that water is used throughout the play, which functions both thematically and as one of the major props of the show. So the first thing that we see, which is almost a prologue, even though this particular version of the script doesn't label it a prologue, we have a silent performance element. So on stage, there are at least 3 distinct containers of water. There's a metal bucket on a table upstage. There's a metal metal tub type thing, sort of center stage, and there's a vase of flowers with water under the table upstage. So in the very beginning of the play, the first thing that we see occur visually is this. The actress enters the stage. She places her water bottle next to one of the there's a water bottle also. Next to one of the buckets and goes to hang up the towel she's carrying, looking up to the ceiling, trying to ascertain where the water is dripping from. She goes over to the glass vase and moves it slightly to catch the imaginary drops. She looks over to the small bucket on the table and goes toward it. Looks at herself in the reflection of the water, cups the water in her hands and watches it fall through the cracks. Starts to try and hold the water, catching it in her hands, but it always falls through. Suddenly a storm brews in the bucket. She moves the water around vigorously and pulls out a bubble of water made from see-through plastic. She is surprised, uncomprehending. Holds the bubble delicately, pats it, slowly maneuvers it over to the edge of the bucket and onto the table. She gently moves the bubble across the table. The bubble seems to want to see over the edge. It peers over and gets a fright at the darkness over the edge. Pulls back, sits, and then curiosity overcomes it and it, the bubble, looks over the front edge of the table, pulls back in fear and then goes forward to look again. Peering over the edge, it loses its balance, fights to stay on the table, and then falls onto the floor and bursts. The actress reaches out in vain with an outstretched hand to catch the bubble. Short, sharp intake of breath. So it's a really interesting opening performance scene. Again, no words here, no dialogue. But we've got a number of interesting thematic elements represented by the way that this performer is engaging with the water. So she uses the water as a kind of quasi-mirror, looks at her own reflection in the water, which of course echoes the Narcissus myth from ancient Greece. So we have, again, a different mythical component being evoked here. But that idea of seeing the self reflected is thematically important here, because one of the big concerns in the play is the interconnections between mothers and daughters. So actually in the notes for the play, it actually starts out with a quote from Carl Jung, the psychologist, who says, "We could therefore say that every mother contains her daughter in herself and every daughter her mother, and that every woman extends backwards into her mother and forwards into her daughter." So this idea of the interconnectedness of generations, particularly matrilineal generations, is a big component of the play and really guides a lot of the interactions between Demeter, her daughter Kore, who becomes Persephone, and Demeter's mother Hecate, which also, incidentally, makes up, at least for the first portion of the play, until Persephone goes off with Hades, who never appears on stage. That also makes up the archetypal trio of the mother, the virgin, and the crone, which, according to Jung, are three of the key archetypes in the collective unconscious, in the way that human beings as such experience the world. But we've got that idea here. She looks over to the small bucket on the table and goes towards it, looks at herself in the reflection of the water. So that idea of seeing oneself reflected back in a slightly distorted way. In a sense, we have that thematically in the, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later on, in these sort of almost interpenetrating identities of the three women, particularly Demeter and Kore. Then we've got this action of trying to pick up the water and stop it sliding through her fingers, stop it falling out from her cupped hands. And we have this represented, this is sort of embodying the theme, the idea of time slipping away, of losing control, of in some ways being separated. I mean, Demeter's big conflict in the play is that she loses Persephone. She loses the thing that she's trying to hold on to, and she can never get it back once it's lost, or she can never get it back in quite the same way. And so we have that literally physically played out with the water escaping. And then we have this plastic bubble, this bubble of water that is looking over the edge of the table, that's trying to see beyond the boundaries of its own container. And this is what we get with Kore, because one of the big questions for Demeter is whether Kore has been kidnapped, which is what Demeter initially believes, or whether Kore has left of her own accord seeking freedom, which is what Hecate says. And so that thematic, that idea of the bubble trying to find new experiences, even if it's dangerous, is sort of played out here. The other thing... So the other thing I'll say very quickly about water is it also has symbolic associations with ebbs and flows, with dividing and coming back together, with movement, with sort of swirling whirlpools and rushing rivers. The river of time metaphor, for instance, becomes sort of central to the play. So water is really, because water is such a fluid element, such a dynamic element, it's really associated with changes and shifts and things like this. And that's really at the heart of the Persephone myth, is this idea of change and of time moving forward, but also this sort of round cyclicalness. The tide goes in, the tide comes out. The seasons come and the seasons go. And that's part of the Demeter and Persephone myth, right? Is that when Persephone is on Earth with Demeter, Demeter is happy and it's summer. When Persephone goes back to her husband Hades in the underworld, Demeter is devastated, and so we get winter. So we have the cycles of seasons, which again are in some ways symbolically linked to the cycle of the tides, for instance. But the other element of this that I want to come back to and talk a little bit more about is this idea of seeing oneself in the other, particularly in matrilineal relationships. Because this is really important, we get almost a collapsing of the identities between Hecate, Demeter, and Kore/Persephone. These three generations almost collapse into one. And partly that occurs because they're all performed by the same actor, so the same physical body is representing them, but we also get this played out in the show itself. So for instance, in the scene where Demeter realizes that Kore is gone, she says this set of lines twice. She says, "My girl, my daughter, my young, my youth." Now that last bit, "my youth," is really interesting there, because we can read that as the youth who is Kore, who was mine, my daughter, is now gone. We can also read that as my youth, the youth that I had, represented by Kore or embodied by Kore. And so in that sense, the loss of Kore is also the loss of Demeter's youth, of a component of Demeter's identity. So we have that sort of collapsing of those two characters. Then there's a couple of really interesting stage directions. The one says that Demeter is showing an old photograph of the actress's mother as a young girl to the audience. So this is the first picture. The actor of the play, which in this case was Jennie Reznek, in the original production run. No, you could do this. You could do this elsewhere without Jennie Reznek necessarily. But the photograph of the missing daughter is in fact a photograph of the actor's mother as a child. So we're transposing that mother-daughter relationship. And then slightly later we get a stage direction that says, "Distributing missing posters with an image of a contemporary girl, perhaps the actress herself when she was younger." So again, we have that collapsing of the characters. We have the missing child, Kore, being represented by photographs first of the actor's mother and then maybe of the actor herself. So this is an interesting use of visuals to play out that collapsing of these distinct identities. Now, the other thing I want to talk about with this play is that it is very meta-theatrical. This is clearly not a play that wants you to suspend disbelief. And there's actually a couple of interesting instances where the actor talks to specific people in the audience or specific members of the crew. So I want to talk through this one little bit, and this is in scene 6. It says, the stage directions say, "The actress is collapsed in the bath, breathing heavily from the exertion of the previous sequence. The lights come up brightly, including the audience, as if the show is over. She pants, exhausted. She talks directly to the audience. She says, 'You know, one thing that I've understood about growing older, it's not that you can't do things. You can. You just have to build in recovery periods.' Addressing someone in the audience, she says, 'Please, man, sorry. Won't you bring me my water bottle? Thank you so much. Such service.' Opening the bottle to drink, she says, 'I won't be a minute. Just read your program, talk amongst yourselves.' She drinks. 'I have to wait for my heart rate to return to normal.' 'Okay, Taryn,' addressing the stage manager, 'I'm almost there.' Thumbs up, but lights don't immediately change. Irritated and insisting, she indicates again and the lights change. So, again, we've got the water elements here, both of her in the bath and of her drinking the water. But one of the things that strikes me about that particular interaction, the whole you have to build in rest periods. So first off, we've got the thematic element of aging again, which we already see with Demeter especially, and with Hecate. But there's also an element of sort of additional meta-theatrical awareness because this is a one-person show. So the performer never gets to leave the stage to take a rest. Like, normally when you're doing a show with a number of people, you as an individual performer are not on stage the entire time. So you can go backstage, you can have a drink, you can have a rest, you can do whatever it is that you want to do. But with a one-person show where you're the only one who's on stage, you are on stage the entire time that performance is going on. And so in that sort of acknowledgement of, I'm taking a little bit of a break, we actually maybe get a commentary on the challenges of putting on a one-person show. So it's very interesting, very insightful.